My name is Amanda. I am a clinical director at CST Academy and one of our speech language pathologists.
And my name is Erica Murphy. I am also a speech language pathologist. I also see feeding clients at our clinic, and I am a clinic director at our 1422 West Willow Street location.
Amazing. And then along the way, we would love to hear if you guys have any questions that come up as we go through the slides. So you can just feel free to add your questions to the chat or unmute yourself and jump right in. And we would love to have those open discussions tonight.
All right. So some of your kiddos may already be in feeding therapy, but the first slide just goes over some signs that your child would benefit from feeding therapy if they're not already in those services here. And some of those signs would include frequent coughing or gagging during meal times, eating less than 20 different foods, meal times feeling pretty stressful for families, having trouble staying at the table during meals, having some bigger emotions when presented with new or non-preferred foods. So these are all kind of some signs that your child would benefit from a feeding evaluation, so that a speech language pathologist can decide whether those ongoing feeding therapy services would be recommended. And so our presentation today is going to be kind of what does feeding therapy look like, but also what are some ways that you can support your child's feeding in the home environment as well.
Great. So especially important as we talk through all these things tonight, just to consider is that eating is highly individualized. So everybody, including us and our neurodiverse learners, have unique needs and preferences in their mealtime routines, as well as the foods that they eat during their meal times. So I thought we could do another parent participation in the group chat. And just taking a look at the different toasts on the left and then the different colored coffees on the right. And maybe you don't even drink coffee or eat toast, but just go ahead and share kind of your most preferred toast when it's toasted, how burnt or uncooked you like it, and same with your coffee, how much creamer or no creamer that you enjoy.
A couple responses. Okay, so Ashley D. Okay, yeah, like middle. Oh, C, E, C. Okay, so kind of more towards the top or middle. C. Yeah, I think for me, I'm definitely in the middle too. I would say like D or E. I'm definitely like it toasted, but not super crispy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm more like G. I love super crispy, like not burnt, but almost there. And I like my coffee pretty black. So I think those are just really great examples of how we all have different preferences in the ways that our foods are prepared. And same with your kiddos. We all have those different preferences and needs, and you might go to the coffee shop and ask for toast and a coffee. And if they're not preparing it in your preferred way, that might ruin your morning. So it's just something to consider and reflect upon as we also think about our kiddos and their preferred ways of eating and also the foods that they enjoy eating. So just taking that into consideration as we walk through all of these slides and the strategies, what might work for your child might not work for someone else's child. And so your speech therapist and their team will also kind of talk you through that and work with you on a team about those things.
Okay, so before we get to what feeding therapy looks like and supports for home, we kind of wanted to touch on factors that impact feeding for our neurodiverse children. So there are quite a few different factors that we're going to dive a little bit deeper in to talk through how these can impact feeding for our kiddos. But some of those factors we're going to touch on today will include physical and physiological factors, environmental factors, sensory processing, oral motor skills, and then learning styles as well. So we're going to start with physical and physiological factors.
All right. So, physical and physiological factors are a child's physical and mental well-being, including their medical needs and level of regulation. So, the image on the right shows a visual, and basically, we can think about feeding as that tip of the iceberg. So, your child's feeding difficulties or challenges with eating is what you might see and might be the most prevalent aspect that you're aware of. However, what's under the water is what really impacts that feeding ability and those eating challenges. So some of those factors include the way that their body is feeling. So if their tummy is feeling upset, when was the last time they used the bathroom? Their muscles and their senses. How are they feeling regulated in the current environment? As Erica mentioned, also their learning styles, which are unique for each of our learners, and then their development, nutritional status, and the environment.
Okay. So next we're going to touch on how a child's environment can impact their feeding. So some components of a child's environment during meal times can include their seating and the room arrangement. So we're going to touch base on this a little bit later on, but um, for our kiddos and their mealtime routine, it is super important for our kiddos to feel supported in a seat so that they're able to attend to that mealtime routine and increase that engagement during meal times. So that seating and room arrangement is super important for meals. Some other components of a child's environment that can impact their meal times include auditory input, so sounds in their environment. So if a child maybe is in a noisy environment, such as a restaurant or in a busier lunchroom, those can all impact a child's engagement during meal times. Visual input, so this could include like lighting, or it could also include the physical food itself. So that presentation of the food, so the size of the non-preferred food on their plate, or how much of that non-preferred food is on their plate can definitely impact their engagement in that typical mealtime routine. And lastly, smells can definitely impact our kiddos' engagement during meals. So whether or not it's their food in front of them, if someone maybe across the room has a food that is something that's not preferred for a child, that can also impact that engagement as well.
All right, sensory processing. So neurodiverse children rely on visual, taste, and tactile senses more heavily during meal times than neurotypical individuals. And so research shows that based on that, any visual changes, taste or tactile changes, and also smell, as Erica mentioned, will highly impact, their ability to engage in that mealtime and also positively participate and feel safe in that environment. So, for example, the visual just shows all four of those images are carrots. However, those carrots are presented and prepared very differently in each of those images. So, grated, steamed, roasted, cooked, and chopped. So all of these different carrots, they might taste different depending on how they were cooked. If they were steamed, in a pan or in the microwave, if they were roasted in the oven, cooked and chopped raw. So they might taste differently. They all obviously look very different. They might smell different depending on how they were prepared, and keeping in mind even like when they're being prepared in the kitchen, those smells are going to be very obvious, and your child will be highly sensitive to those smells. So considering that, as well as the feel. So grated carrots might feel soft and a little bit mushy versus a cooked and chopped carrot that might be a little bit harder, or a roasted carrot that might be crispier. So those small changes in the way that carrot or any food that your family is preparing and eating together make a big difference for your child. So that consideration is very important for them. Another thing with taste to consider is that research shows that neurodiverse children process some taste profiles differently. So, for example, sour and bitter taste, they process differently than a neurotypical individual. But they process sweet and salty taste similar to neurotypical individuals. So, that is why we might see that so many of our learners and your child might, prefer those sweet and salty tastes. Similarly, if your child really prefers those crunchy, crispy textures, they process those textures the same as neurotypical individuals. But those softer, mushier feeling, wet textures, they elicit like a higher brain reaction and brain response for them. So that's why you might notice that they're more sensitive to those textures.
Okay.
Oh, I see. My son loves fresh carrots, but won't touch steamed. So great. I love that you recognize that, and hopefully that provides more of like an understanding or a reasoning behind why he might prefer fresh carrots but not steamed carrots. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, so next we are going to talk a little bit about learning styles. So we also know that our neurodiverse children learn differently. And the learning style that we really have learned a lot about with our neurodiverse children is microscopic learning. And so this is when a child examines all details in a situation, impacting their perception of the situation. So when a small detail is changed, the child might feel as though they have encountered a whole different situation. And so in the next slide, we're going to see an example of this microscopic learning. So this might be a reason why packaging for some of the foods that your child might see might elicit a different response. If, for example, your child loves Cheerios from that specific box, you might see them gravitate towards that specific food. But then if it's presented maybe in a different box from a different store, that's might be why you might see them not as interested, because that changes the whole property of that food. So that's a completely different food for that learner. Another example Amanda and I learned about in one of our CEUs was sometimes a kiddo might eat or try a food, for example, like at school, they might eat, I think the example was like a hamburger in the school cafeteria, but not at home. And that example kind of demonstrated that, okay, that hamburger in that school lunch comes on a blue tray. And in that environment, I have my peers around me. I have specific things going on in my environment. So that's kind of that food takes on those properties of their environment. And so when that's presented at home, those environmental cues are different. And so that's why we might see those changes in interest in those foods when we are in different environments.
Great. Oral motor skills might also impact your child's eating abilities or participation in the mealtime. So we want to go more in depth in the other aspects just because we find that is more relevant for our neurodiverse children. However, if you notice that your child has chewing and or swallowing difficulties, oral motor skills are those chewing and swallowing abilities that allow your child to safely consume a variety of consistencies from liquids to purees to different solids, whether that be soft solids or crunchy hard solids. So some signs of difficulties with chewing might include gagging, pocketing their food or holding the food in their cheeks without swallowing it, stuffing their mouth with the foods, as well as spillage or messy eating or coughing. So if you notice any of these things during your child's mealtime while they're eating even preferred foods, that might be an indication that they have some chewing or swallowing abilities that are also impacting their ability to participate in that eating environment.
Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about some of those factors that might impact our child's engagement or interest in their meals, next we're going to shift our focus on feeding therapy and what those goals might look like in your child's ongoing feeding therapy sessions at the clinic. So our top priority in all of our feeding therapy sessions will include that mealtime safety. So that will always be our priority if we start with a child and we maybe have concerns for chewing those specific consistencies or any swallowing concerns as well. Also that regulation piece, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. And then some other goals for our feeding therapy sessions will focus on establishing a mealtime routine so that we can engage with some of those foods during that specific time in their day. The next goal that we will focus on is increasing those opportunities for diet expansion. So practicing those food stretches to explore some of those new or non-preferred foods. Next, we can work on maintaining comfort and feeling full during those meals, and then increasing that internal motivation and enjoyment during meal times, as well as independence.
Great. So before we continue, we just want to emphasize that feeding therapy takes a team, and that is just so important. And as a part of that team will include those multidisciplinary therapists that are a part of your child's team here at CST Academy. So the SLP might be leading those feeding therapy sessions, but then working and collaborating with those other therapists to ensure that those routines and any strategies used during those meal times are embedded in their day-to-day at CST Academy, with their BCBA, collaborating with the OT and PT, as Erica mentioned, for sensory regulation and safe positioning while eating. And most importantly, we just want to emphasize that you as the parents and caregivers are such a huge aspect of that team. And so they'll collaborate very closely with you to ensure that, the goals for feeding therapy align with your goals at home. But then also they might include some parent and caregiver therapy goals so that you feel like you can participate and try out these strategies at home to see how they're going. Because the meal times at home are just as important, if not more important, than those meal times that are happening at the clinic. And so we just want to also share some ideas and ways that you can be even more a part of that feeding therapy team for your child. And some ways might include, asking to observe a session for feeding therapy during their day here at CST Academy, asking to Zoom in if you're not able to join them in person, and then packing foods that are recommended and suggested by the feeding therapist so that we can ensure that we try our best to incorporate what you're eating at home as a family into those meal times here, so that with that microscopic learning, they're learning how to eat those foods here and in the home environment. And then just wanted to also touch on other medical professionals who may be involved in your child's care, just depending on your SLP's recommendations and referrals, and depending on your child's individual medical needs. A pediatric dentist, a registered dietitian, psychologist, or a GI doctor, if they're having some tummy challenges, might be also involved in your child's feeding therapy team.
Okay, so when we're looking at goals for feeding therapy, like we touched on before, our first goal is always going to be to focus on the child's safety during their meals. And what that might look like is working on finding and establishing a safe seat during mealtime so the child's body can feel supported in space during their meals and feel like they can focus on that oral motor component of chewing. Sometimes it can be difficult if we don't have our body in a safe seat in that 90-90-90 positioning. And so by that, I mean kind of our knees are at a 90-degree angle, our feet and our ankles are at a 90-degree angle, and then our hips are. So we're kind of in our optimal seating seating and positioning. And that can help us then when we're feeling our body is supported, then we can focus on that oral management piece as well. And also that food exploration. So that's our first step, is trying to identify that seating and positioning. And a lot of that comes from collaboration with the child's occupational therapist as well as their physical therapist. They have a lot of great information with that. And also, a very high priority for us during a child's meal is to make sure that they're feeling regulated. Sometimes meal times can be very dysregulating for our kiddos. And so we want to always start off that routine with as much of kind of helping that child get to that just right state, arousal space. And so we also do collaborate with the child's occupational therapist to work on implementing some of those activities in their sensory diet prior to transitioning to the meal. And then if we do become dysregulated during the meal, sometimes presentation of a non-preferred food can become dysregulating for a child. So how can we work to get our child back to that just right arousal phase? And so we also collaborate with our occupational therapy team to provide some of those in the moment support so that the child is feeling supported. And when our child's body feels supported, then they're able to better engage in that mealtime routine.
Great. So a consistent mealtime routine is key. And Erica touched on these aspects a little bit, but neurodiverse children really rely on that anticipation of what is next and what can they anticipate happening in their routine. So any change in that routine might also impact their emotional, regulatory state. And so starting that mealtime with those sensory regulating activities as recommended by their occupational therapist if they are seen by an OT. Otherwise, the speech pathologist will, work with you to embed those highly sensory regulating activities for your child so that they can feel safe and comfortable and ready to join the table with you for those meal times. And then a clear beginning, middle, and end to that meal time so they can anticipate what's to come next. So below includes an example of a visual schedule that your child might use at the clinic or at home. And it just includes, what's to come. First, we're going to come to the table. We might participate in a really fun sensory regulating activity together. And then we're getting ready for that meal time with any other preparation that needs to happen. After that meal time, we say goodbye to our foods and do a little cleanup routine. And we also know that a lot of our kiddos love to sing songs too. So incorporating preferred songs, their favorite songs to get them ready to come to the table. Sometimes us during SLPs, we make up songs about chewing and playing with our foods and exploring new foods during the meal time. And then presenting familiar plates and utensils is always really helpful for that routine and anticipation to make sure that they feel comfortable with that it's a familiar setting for them and they can trust what's going to happen during that meal time. So oftentimes the SLP might ask you to send in a plate that you use at home that they really enjoy, or using a cup here at the clinic that's the same type of cup that they use at home, just so that that familiarity is comfortable for them.
Okay, so next we're going to touch on, now that we've discussed some of those mealtime strategies that we implement during our sessions at the clinic, we're going to touch on kind of what our bigger goals are for our feeding therapy sessions. So something that I feel like can sometimes feel counterintuitive is that feeding therapy does not always involve eating. Our goal for our feeding therapy sessions, our primary goal is to always make sure we're building trust with our kiddos during meal times. Trust is such an important part of meal times, and establishing that right away can be really meaningful for the child to trust you when you are encouraging or presenting them with those non-preferred foods. And so building trust during meal times might include providing that child with a way to, if we are given a food that we're not ready to put in our body, we might give them a space to put that food, to show us that they are not ready for that food. And then we would honor that, and establish that trust right away so that we can always, we can continue to practice encouraging some of those food exploration activities, but not pushing us to the point where we would lose that trust. Our goal is also to ensure safety during meal times, which I know we've kind of touched on with that seating and positioning. We also want to create a positive and enjoyable mealtime experience. We know a lot of our learners really learn the most when they are excited and happy and engaged. And so we know that's the case with learning new information in the classroom and in their ABA sessions. And so we also want to embed those similar values within our feeding sessions with them. We also want to increase confidence in interacting with food. And we'll talk a little bit more about what food stretches will look like in a little bit. But our goal is to build that flexibility during mealtime. So it's not for us to have our child eat a certain amount of food or eat a certain food. It's to build that flexibility so that they can feel comfortable exploring new foods in the future and then decide whether or not that's something they want to keep in their food inventory, but providing them with the tools so that they can feel comfortable exploring those foods and building that flexibility. And then I kind of skipped ahead. So supporting that internal motivation to engage in the mealtime. We want our children to feel intrinsically motivated to explore those foods, because we're not always going to be with our kiddos. And so we want to provide them with those tools and that feeling of safety when exploring those non-preferred foods when we're not there with them in the future. So.
Okay, so kind of going off of that, how we might not just be eating during those feeding therapy sessions, and we want to talk about and hone in on the steps to eating for neurodiverse children. So feeding does not begin with food being placed in the mouth. There are many steps that happen before a child and before we put food in our mouth. So kind of going back to the sensory processing aspect of it, they're experiencing that food through all of their senses before it's being placed in their mouth. And so that does really impact their experience with that food. So for neurodiverse children, these steps to eating a new food are modified to support them based on their unique ways of learning. So a child might benefit from first seeing a food for the first time, and seeing that food may not be on their plate, seeing the food for the first time. It might be on the kitchen counter or on your plate for the first time, and then gradually increasing that opportunity to explore the food in different ways by maybe progressing to seeing the food on their plate or seeing the food in a bowl next to their plate at the mealtime. Watching you eat the food is another visual way that child is experiencing that food. We might then progress to interacting with that food using a utensil or through a container. So if your child is highly sensitive to those smells or those feelings of new textures, we might first use fun forks or toothpicks to interact with new foods, or put the food in a container or a clear Ziploc bag and feel it through the bag so that their hands aren't getting messy during that interaction, and they aren't able to smell that really strong smell of the carrot or whatever that new food might be. And then getting to that stage of touching the food with their hands or with a different type of utensil, touching it close to their body and near their mouth. And then, when it gets to that stage of touching it to their face and being able to taste and explore it in that way. So we're always giving your child that opportunity to explore it, but we're meeting them at the level that they feel safe and comfortable so that they can trust us as well. Because as soon as we jump and kind of skip some of those steps to eating the food, we might lose trust, and they might become dysregulated, as Erica explained previously. So we kind of talk about this visual of the different steps to eating for neurodiverse children.
All right. And then the last chunk of our presentation is to give you guys some ideas of how to embed some of our mealtime, just general mealtime strategies in the home environment. Like we kind of touched on earlier in the presentation, all of our recommendations for the most part are going to be specialized for your child and will be recommended by your child's SLP. However, these are just some ideas of ways you guys can promote some of those positive mealtime routines in the home environment. So you guys can feel as though you're practicing some of these strategies outside of the clinic as well. And so sorry. And the strategies we're going to touch on is a mealtime routine, reducing pressure, and then increasing opportunities for diet expansion.
Okay, reducing pressure. So we want to offer foods and provide opportunities to interact with foods rather than placing demands to interact with different foods. So we really like this table to provide examples of ways that you might be unintentionally placing demands during meal times. Even, we really have to think about these ways that demands might be being placed unintentionally during meal times and how to kind of reflect that and instead make an offer to interact with new foods. So we'll talk through these examples to hopefully allow you to also reflect on these aspects during your meal times at home. So one example of a demand during a mealtime would be placing a child's food on their plate for them. And instead, we can do a family style, buffet style meal where there are all the different foods in different bowls and larger platters and plates. And the child has the opportunity to serve themselves their foods, even if that's only their preferred foods. That gives them the opportunity to have control over how much food is being put on their plate and what kinds of foods are being put on their plate as well. Another demand would be asking your child to take a bite. So instead, we can model eating the food. We always highly encourage eating with your child. Even if you're eating something different than your child is eating at that mealtime, it provides such an amazing model, similar to like peer models that they have at CST Academy all the time. Oftentimes we see that they're just so naturally motivated by your models as parents and caregivers, as well as their peers models. So that's why, they might be eating lunch alongside peers at the clinic, or the therapist might be eating another food alongside of them or interacting with other foods with them at the table because that is intrinsically motivating for children. Another example of a demand would be giving the child a whole piece of food, especially if it's a newer food for them or a working food, a less preferred food. Instead, we can offer them small pieces. Those whole or larger amounts of food, those higher quantities can be very overwhelming. I always like to use the analogy of like spiders. Like I am afraid of spiders. I don't like spiders. If you put one spider on the table and it crawled across, I might be a little bit afraid or hesitant at first, but if you put a whole heaping pile of spiders in front of me, I would run away from the table. So it's similar, they're learning and we want to give them that opportunity where they're comfortable. Asking the child to serve the food to themselves. So that's a demand, we're asking them to put food on their plates, and instead, if they're not ready for that stage yet, we can ask if they want to serve other people at the table. So they can serve their siblings some food if they're open to it, or they can put some food on your plate in that buffet style manner. Expecting the child to use their hands to touch different foods at the table. Instead, as I mentioned previously, we can offer utensils or fun toothpicks as an option if they're not at that touch level just yet with the food. And then offering the child one version of a food versus offering the child two different versions of the food. So I like to think back to the image of the taco when Erica was talking about those accommodations and different like ways that we can present foods to a child. So if there's a whole taco already made for them versus like if they have all the different toppings that they get to choose from to make their own taco, they might be way more motivated to interact and explore and make a taco if they have that control over the situation.
Okay, and then as we are doing mealtime routines with our kiddos, we always want to be monitoring for stress cues. We added some examples here, but they can definitely look different for your child. So some of those stress cues that we might see with our kiddos at the clinic include facial grimacing, gagging, sudden change in that emotional state, leaving the table, pushing the food away from their body, clenching their fists or their jaw. And so if we are noticing some of these stress cues during our meal times, we want to ensure that we are providing our learners with tools to be able to leave or move away from that food in order to resume back to that just right arousal state. And so what that might look like in our sessions is sometimes we might have a separate bowl off to the side. Sometimes with some of our learners, we might have a garbage can on the side and they can put those foods that we're not ready to have on our in our immediate space in the garbage can if we're not ready for that food. And that can provide that child with that control or that feeling that they have that ability to protest or not engage. And then we can gradually work towards tolerating that food back in our immediate space as well. But this will allow our children to be able to fuel their bodies for the remainder of the meal time versus sometimes if we like we talked about some of those demands if we're placing that demand during the meal time and then you might leave the table that might lead to maybe not giving our child that full ability to fuel their body for the meal, so giving them that opportunity to be able to get back in that just right arousal space, and then we can gradually work on reintroducing that food into their space in a way that's meaningful for the child.
Okay, and then we wanted to share more ideas for providing opportunities before and after the meal time. As we mentioned, those opportunities to explore foods and eat foods doesn't always just need to happen while sitting at the table. So some other ways to interact and provide those opportunities would be food preparation. So having your child help make their preferred foods, whether that be a smoothie or a cookie or opening the package of chips that they really enjoy from the cabinet. Another idea would be passing plates to one another or setting the table so they get to pick out their plate and their cup and put it on the table, help you pick out your plate, set the napkins out or the utensils is a fun way. I already mentioned this one, but serving parents and siblings at the table if they're not ready to serve those foods to themselves, and encouraging your child to engage in a cleanup routine. So oftentimes our learners at the clinic, they love to kiss the foods goodbye or throw them in the garbage can like it's a basketball hoop. Other ways that they can engage in a cleanup routine if they're not at that level of actually interacting with the food might be to put the plate in the sink or clear their plate or wash their hands at the end. And keeping that just right arousal state for them might also include that same sensory regulation activity that started the mealtime. We might end the mealtime with it. So maybe it's another song that we're singing to end the mealtime routine, or if we started the mealtime with a fun Play-Doh activity, we're ending then the mealtime with a fun Play-Doh activity. So those are some ideas for engaging in a cleanup routine if they're not ready to, clean their messy plate just yet.
Okay, and then some additional mealtime strategies. So, working towards your child sitting at the table with the family during meal times. And so, this will look like finding a supportive seating option for your child during meal times. And this is super important so that you, as parents, can be those models for engaging with some of those newer foods in a positive way. Amanda talked about that buffet style, but that goal is for the child to have some of the family's food on their plate if they're tolerating, or maybe on a separate learning plate off to the side. And also, the family can have some of the child's food on their plate as well. So it's that mutual exchange during meals. We can also, during meal times, make modifications. So if you have some of your child's preferred food on your plate, you can model making changes to that food on your plate. Because like we said, sometimes we make those changes to that food that can change that food in entirety. So when we are modeling some of those changes to those foods, that's a way of that child building some of that flexibility into their mealtime routine. So maybe they have highly preferred food is graham crackers. So maybe you have some graham crackers on your plate and you model breaking that graham cracker in a fun and playful way. And then you can model taking some of those bites of that modified food, and then that can be an invitation for the child to join in, maybe observe and interact with the food at that state that they're ready for. And then also we can present some new foods. We kind of talked about this, not on the child's plate. So as you're doing the buffet style, your child's not ready to have that food on their regular plate. You can have that learning plate off to the side. So when you're serving that food family style, they can choose how much goes into that learning plate. But that again offers that invitation for that child to explore that food during the meal. And then we'll always want to identify and monitor those stress cues. So if you are seeing some of those stress cues, maybe with having that food on their plate, maybe you can encourage them to use one of their fun utensils to spear the food and put it into their learning plate. Or if it's in their learning plate, maybe we can push it a little bit further away from the table. So we're still able to engage in that mealtime routine and fuel our bodies, but we're still getting some of that practice and learning opportunities from that food being near us on the table. And then next, these are just some examples of what we talked about. So when you guys are doing buffet style during meal times, you can use tongs to have, it's a fun way to pick some of those foods and put them onto the plate. This next picture of the family all sitting around the table, I feel like one of the really great recommendations I talk to families a lot about is making food the focus during meal times. And so if you guys are modeling some of that exploration with your food on your plate and making that food that focus, then that kind of again invites the child to imitate you if it looks fun and engaging. So sometimes we'll use some of those fun routines like ready, set, crunch, or we'll maybe if we have some of our puree in a bowl, we'll model some songs while we're engaging with that. And again, that model is inviting the child to watch you, to imitate you, but we're not placing that demand on the child to engage with that food. Allowing our child to maybe help with preparing or picking the menu for the week, and then also allowing them to help with that food preparation during or before meal times as well, whether that's putting some of the foods on in some of those bigger bowls or stirring some of those foods. We want to always engage them in that meal preparation before meal times.
And then providing accommodations at meal times. So this is something that we will often encourage your child's team to embed in those mealtime routines is some accommodations to consider, especially depending on the environment they're eating that meal or snack. So an example would be using that specific plate, cup, or utensil across meal times. Using a divider plate is a great accommodation. So one section of that divider plate can be for learning foods, or your child gets to choose which foods go into each section of that divider plate. They can also use that separate learning plate next to their preferred plate. So incorporating them in that participation as well. Noise canceling headphones can be really beneficial if the environment is too loud or noisy for your child. Again, this can impact their regulation during mealtime. So if the environment is too noisy and loud, you might notice that they're unable to actively engage and participate at the table with you because of those potential distractions to their learning environment. Creating that visual schedule to communicate what is happening next in that mealtime routine, and also containing the smell of the food. So if you really enjoy a specific food at the mealtime, such as broccoli, but your child does not enjoy that food, and maybe it's that we're containing the smell of that food while it's at the table in a container with a lid or a bag that can be zipped. And you might notice that they're more willing and able to positively engage in that mealtime with you.
Okay, so next we are going to touch on food jags. So food jags can occur when a child eats the same food repeatedly, often prepared in the same way. And this can lead to what we call burnout, and sometimes this food can completely be eliminated from the child's core diet. And so, another helpful tool that we can work on in feeding therapy are ways to avoid these food jags or work towards expanding that flexibility. And so, when we do have that goal in avoiding those food jags, we would encourage you to work with your feeding therapist and create a list of foods that the child consistently eats. So we would call that the food inventory of the child. And then you and your feeding therapist will work on making very subtle shifts to those preferred foods in their feeding therapy and even in some of your meal times at home. And with our feeding therapy, we typically will start with doing some of those food modifications with some of those least nutritious foods. And that sometimes if we do too big of a stretch, that might lead to a child maybe not eating that food again. And so we always want to start with making those stretches with some of those foods that don't have as much nutritional value. In the case that maybe those stretches do lead to maybe not wanting those foods again. So sometimes we'll start with maybe, like I said, like a graham cracker or a French fry, and we might make some of those food modifications to those foods so that we can build that flexibility and avoid those food jags and feeling stuck. And then typically if our kiddos have maybe fewer than 5 foods in their diet, instead of doing those food modifications, we would work on introducing some new foods into that food inventory before making those changes. And so again, this is very individualized. So with your child's feeding therapist, you will work on those stretches and seeing if that would be an appropriate tool to work on with your child. And so in our next couple slides, we're going to talk through some of what those food stretches or modifications will look like.
Yes. So we have used this term a couple of times so far. So what is a food stretch? And we'll do a deeper dive of this. We would love your participation as well in these next few slides so that we can make this as relevant for your child and helpful as possible for your meal times at home. But a food stretch, so this term was coined by Marcia Dunn. She is actually an occupational therapist who does a ton of feeding therapy. And so we also take a lot of her CEU courses to support that neurodiversity and responsive feeding approach with our clients and children. So a food stretch helps a child learn to enjoy a new food or food property in teeny tiny steps, starting from a familiar food or food property. Then you take that familiar food and you stretch from it to something, that the child knows and likes, and making those teeny tiny changes to then expand on their food repertoire. So expanding on that food inventory that Erica discussed, that the ultimate goal is to add more foods to their food inventory. And so here we have some examples of small changes that are food stretches for your child. So an example would be changing the packaging. So if a puree is in one specific pouch and all of a sudden the brand changes, the appearance of the packaging, again, that child is learning and it appears as if it's a whole new food to them. So, but that can be another small change that can help them expand on their food repertoire. Changing the bowl or the dish that the food is presented in, or even using a different utensil in the mealtime, helps with that flexibility. So changing the shape of the food. So we talked about those carrots, whether that might be, they're cut into strips versus the grated carrots or the roasted carrots. Changing the color of the food. So if they love red bell peppers, we might then, provide that opportunity to interact with green bell peppers. Maybe the temperature of the food is if they like really hot foods or only cold foods, maybe we're just slightly modifying that temperature of the food. Also modifying the texture of the food. So if they like super crispy sweet potato fries, maybe some of those fries on their plate are less crispy or less cooked. And then taste and flavor. So sometimes we call this like the crumbing or the sprinkling technique too, where you might together sprinkle like some salt or a different seasoning onto that food and slightly modify the taste or the flavor of that preferred food. And then here are some images just that you can visualize examples of these food stretches. So in the top left-hand corner, we have that puree in a pouch. And some examples of a food stretch with that puree might be pouring it in a cup with a fun straw of their choice, or pouring it in their favorite bowl with their favorite spoon. Again, we can like paint with it and make that a really fun experience, stirring alongside with their favorite song, as Erica mentioned. In the top right-hand corner, we have maybe your child loves crackers and they love cheese and they like those things separately. So here's an example of a couple of different ways that you could offer a food stretch to your child. It might be to add cheese on top of a cracker, change the shape of that slice of cheese. To the right on that cutting board, we have cracker that is crunched into crumbs. So it's that same food, but it's modified in that appearance. So maybe we're sprinkling those crumbs onto the cheese. And then down below, we just have different, plates and utensils that can be good ideas for those food stretches to increase that flexibility during the mealtime. And then one more just visual for you all would be, more examples of these small changes. So if they love chicken nuggets, maybe we're trying a turkey nugget. If they like potato chips, maybe you're modeling eating an apple chip. So again, like that might be a bigger jump for your child. And so instead, maybe you have some apple chips on your plate first to see, how they're participating and how safe they feel with that exposure. Peanut butter with different nut butters, chocolate pudding and chocolate hummus. And then we have plain cereal with flavored cereal, or even a different brand of their preferred cereal is a good example. And then Laura in the chat, the packaging changes has happened twice this week for us. The new branding for the applesauce pouches has made that a hard no for our little guys. So yeah, that's that learning of, now it all of a sudden seems like a brand new food for him because it's in a less familiar packaging. It looks completely different. So yeah, thanks for sharing, Laura. It's challenging.
Okay, and then we are just going to touch on some examples of food stretches. So these are some examples that I've worked on with some of my families where we are working on building that flexibility with our preferred foods. So for example, if we love chicken nuggets, and let's be specific, let's say maybe it's a chicken nugget from a specific restaurant. Maybe it's from, let's say it's Burger King and we like the specific shape of the chicken nugget. We can start there. So some stretch ideas that we can do for preventing those food jags from that specific chicken nugget would be potentially changing the shape of that chicken nugget. So maybe you still do Burger King, maybe you still do all of the same pieces there, but maybe you do like the chicken fry, or and maybe you change like the sauce that it's presented with. Some other ideas too is maybe you do that same chicken nugget, but instead of eating it from the packaging, maybe you guys eat it from a plate during a meal time. So those are some ideas. We could also do, like, if we love like the home cooked chicken nuggets, we could do the dinosaur shape Purdue nugget or the round shape Purdue nugget. So changing those shapes a little bit around, or how it's prepared. So I use my air fryer all the time. So maybe if we eat our air fried chicken, we could maybe try it in a different form as well. And then Annie's white cheddar shells, I feel like that's I love those. That mac and cheese. And so thinking of other ideas of how we can make some of those food stretches. So instead of doing the white cheddar, maybe we can explore the yellow cheddar. Or I know Banza, I feel like, is a pasta noodle that is chickpea based. So it's a protein. So if your child doesn't have a lot of those proteins in their diet, sometimes we might explore like a chickpea based pasta. So those Banza, but we would still be the same flavor. So the white cheddar shell, it would just be presented from a different box. And then similarly, we've talked about that puree example. And I think with some of these food stretches, something to consider is that when we are making these modifications, because it's changing that food completely, we would not expect that when we have these food stretches, that that would be the child's preferred food. So sometimes I might, if we are doing some food stretches, have that child's like preferred, whether that be like Annie's white cheddar shells in a bowl, and then have that novel presentation as well. So we know that that's not the expectation for the whole entire meal time, but we're going to explore and learn about this new type as well. So we're still kind of fueling our child for that meal time, but practicing that exposure to some of those new food stretches. Okay. And I guess we can, for the last few minutes, maybe talk through, are there any preferred foods that your child has? And maybe we could come up with a food stretch for that food with you guys tonight.
Mac and cheese.
Okay. Yeah, great. Is it a specific brand of mac and cheese?
She'll do the Kraft mac and cheese, but it has to be the elbow, or she'll do the Velveeta shells.
Okay.
It has to be like that cheese, like the cheese that comes in the packet, not the powder. She won't eat it.
Okay. Okay. The saucy. The saucy.
Yeah, the sauce cheese. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, yes, those definitely do have a really good taste. I feel like sometimes too with those, because we love like that kind of smoother texture cheese, I feel like you said she'll do like the elbow noodle or the macaroni shell. So I think, like you said, maybe modifying that type of noodle with that presentation. And then another way you can stretch that food is if she prefers it. I know sometimes those Velveeta come in those cups that you put in the microwave. So maybe you can do her preferred cup, and then maybe you could present it from a different bowl during a meal time, and try that as a stretch. And I think what we see is that when we are making those like small little stretches, that does change that food for that child and prevent that jag. So that might be an idea for some of those Velveeta cheese. I feel like I know so much about macaroni and cheese. I'm a fan, but also I feel like, yeah, there's so many different brands out there. So
yeah, we're on the same page with that one, Erica. I was gonna say too, like, I don't know if she's ever helped prepare or watch you prepare it, where you're like opening the pouch of the sauce and pouring it into the noodles, but maybe it's that you get to pour that sauce together onto her preferred noodles in that preferred bowl, but you know, as mom or dad also have your bowl of noodles that are the same shape, but maybe a different brand, such as Banza, where then she gets to help you pour that sauce, that cheese sauce, onto your noodles too. And once you mix it up, it might look very similar. And then you get to kind of participate and engage in that meal together. So yours might be different at first, but as you're modeling eating that different food, she might be like, wait a minute, that looks and tastes just like mine. So that can be another idea for the mac and cheese too. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, great. I love it. Okay. So another example that was shared was pizza from Little Caesars with a side of sauce. Really great one. So, my initial thought for one step of a food stretch would be if your child likes to cut or use utensils, maybe cutting that piece of pizza depending on their preferred shape into different shapes. Maybe we could separate the crust and dip the crust first in that side of sauce. Or if you want to separate the components of a piece of pizza on your plate, you can kind of like separate and have fun with like the cheese and the sauce and the crust and the dip, and then maybe you're dipping the cheese in the sauce separately from the whole pizza. But just like making different shapes out of that pizza would be like maybe one of my initial stages of a food stretch, so that we're not just completely going to a whole different Brandon type of pizza right off the bat.
Yeah, and then I see below, Laura, you said dry pancakes or waffles, and I feel like this is also a really fun one. If these are things you guys, whether they're frozen or you make them at home, I feel like cookie cutters can be a really fun way to make some of those food stretches with some of those pancakes. If it is something you guys do make like on the weekends or something like that, you guys can, if you like the circular shapes or sometimes like the mini shapes of the pancakes, maybe you guys can practice making some different shapes of the pancakes or waffles. I also know waffles sometimes come in stick shapes, and so I feel like making those stretches can be really fun and engage the child into some of those changes as well.
Yeah. Also like different brands of pancakes too. Like I think of like Kodiak cakes versus like they might have a different other brand of pancake, and just like different types of frozen pancakes. Maybe they get to go to the grocery store and help you choose those pancakes or waffles too. And dry is okay. I think that's another thing that we all have to keep in mind is we all have preferences in the ways that we eat food, and how it's prepared. As we mentioned earlier, like the way you like your coffee or your toast. And so sometimes it's okay to just let them have those preferences too in those foods, but making sure that we can be flexible as well. Oh, great. Laura Nina shared an idea for the pancakes and waffles that she started adding a few chocolate chips, small amounts of banana, very, very little. And then he started to become a little bit more open and flexible to having different toppings. So it sounds like you started with a dry topping, Nina, which I think is like brilliant too, because, maybe it's the wet texture of syrup or butter that your child does not enjoy. So adding those different fun sprinkles or toppings can be really fun and engaging. And that's part of that like intrinsic motivation that we talk about too is, then they're motivated to participate in that mealtime when we're making it fun, and inviting for them to get to control those toppings as well. Great. Thank you all for sharing. And this is something that's just like a really fun part of our job as feeding therapists is to, get creative with you with these food stretches. So if your child is currently receiving feeding therapy, please reach out to your SLP to brainstorm these food stretches. You can create a shared Google Doc together with these different ideas of food stretches. And I know we all have fun doing this. Like it's a really fun way to see that flexibility for all children too. Yeah, can you give us permission to accept food waste when stretching and introducing new foods? Yeah, that is definitely a challenge, right? Like you might end up wasting some foods when trying these new things. I think that's a benefit of, and Erica, you can kind of touch on this too, but like first incorporating it maybe on your plate, because then if it's on your plate and it's something that you know that you will eat and enjoy first and you're modeling that, that kind of eliminates the waste. That's also why we encourage smaller amounts versus like a whole piece of that new food stretch, so that you also aren't wasting those foods at home too. Because I know that that can be pricey.
Yes.
Costs can add up too with
Yes.
the food waste.
And I like to always encourage families, like when you're thinking of presenting a new food, always presenting it like the size of a small Lego and thinking of that. So if it is something that, yeah, you, like Amanda said, have a portion on your plate that you're comfortable with eating, but then if it's something that maybe the child has in their learning plate, we can, you know, put like that size of that Lego, so that they're not feeling, and then feeling overwhelmed by that size. And then if they're reaching for more too off your plate, then you might know to add to make some more as well. But yeah, I usually would encourage like starting small, and then as we're becoming more comfortable with that food, inviting them to that opportunity to explore what's on your plate, and then providing more too. So
yeah. And Erica and I, dads are great at eating leftovers and scraps. There you go. That's great. Perfect. Resources and community support. We wanted to share a couple of groups that we highly recommend. They have social media, Facebook, Instagram. They have their own websites. So we encourage you to check these out. So the Chicago Feeding Group is a really great resource and community support for families. If you join their Facebook page or their newsletter list, they are constantly sharing emails of different presentations that you can join. They're often in the evening, so I know Erica and I even enjoy joining those for CEU's continuing education courses in the evening. So hopefully they're after work hours for you all to participate in too. And it is a really great community of, you know, feeding specialists, but also families who are experiencing the same things at home and that you can relate to. And then Get Permission Institute. So this is another group that we are highly supportive of, and check out their website and again, their social media accounts, very evidence-based research. And we also, you know, definitely support that approach of the neurodiversity affirming practices that the Get Permission Institute has. And then also, you know, their responsive feeding practices. So a lot of kind of what we shared in our presentation is what they also follow along with for that feeding approach as well.